Welcome to another episode of Complete Developer Podcast, the podcast by coders for coders about all aspects of creating your best life as a developer.
I'm Will, the accomplished developer and aspiring software architect.
And I'm Beej, the journeyman developer, sharing my journey in development.
Complete Developer Podcast is supported by listeners like you. We are now on Patreon at www.patreon.com/Complete Developer Podcast.
It wasn't all that long ago when many developers dismissed unit testing as being idealistic at best and a huge waste of effort at worst. The attitude has softened relatively recently as more and more developers have learned the value of having a regular testing practice as part of their development. While test-driven development has been pretty popular in some communities for a while, most projects can benefit significantly from unit testing, even if it's not done in the way TDD advocates would like. There are substantial advantages to adequate testing of software, and we'll be covering these throughout the episode. We've brought on John Callaway and Clayton Hunt to answer some of our questions about unit testing and test-driven development. But before we get started, Will, what have you been fighting this week?
Well, I had that surgery for my hernia back right after DevSpace last fall, and everything seemed to be better. And I am experiencing pain again, so I'm going back to the doctors and going through all that junk again. And yeah, that's basically all I've been fighting. But it feels like it's beating the crap out of me. So I guess that's enough for a weekly report.
Man, that stinks. I can only imagine.
Yeah. So how about you, John?
Well, I just got back from Orlando Code Camp, where I gave a presentation using .NET Core on a Raspberry Pi cluster with Docker and OpenFAS. So naturally, I got back and immediately decided that I'm going to tear it all down and reload everything before the next time I give that presentation.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, cool.
That sounds right up my alley too. That's really cool. Clayton, how about you?
Not a whole lot lately. I did get my eyes lasered recently, so I've been recovering from that. It's painful.
I remember when my former mother-in-law did that. She was a big advocate for it, but yeah, that sounds about right. So it's really funny that we're talking about unit testing and test-driven development because tomorrow I'm actually taking a course at work on TDD. I'll be in there with a lot of other developers and our QA from the team I'm on. She wants to understand the testing that developers do and how test-driven development works. Honestly, I kind of respect that enthusiasm. I saw a lot of enthusiasm this past weekend. A friend of ours was in town for spring break / St. Patrick's Day. She works at a college down in Panama City Beach. And so where do people that live in PCB go for spring break? Apparently Nashville. Her flight wasn't until a little later on Sunday, but she had to check out of her hotel, so we had some time to kill between getting brunch and her flight. Driving around town, we found a group of LARPers, or live-action role players, practicing in one of the parks around town. So, of course, we stopped, grabbed a towel from the car, and sat on the grass watching the mayhem as people ran around hitting each other with foam swords. Lots of fun. Speaking of LARPing, though, I've got something kind of interesting and a unique way of using tech for IoTs. This week for IoTs, I have a project called the Hammer of Healing and Destruction. The idea is that the Warhammer here is a LARP weapon that can both heal and hurt. And using the Adafruit LSM303 sensor, the weapon will track your movement to determine what mode you've selected, heal or harm, or how much damage your hit dealt. It will track your movement and sort of what you do to determine the amount of damage and calculate that for you, telling you that with the sound. To heal, you have to place it in a certain position and hold it there to enter healing mode. While the post is just sort of a proof of concept, it's a cool idea to bring a bit of technology and IoT into the Middle Ages. So, Will, who's talking to us this week?
We grabbed a comment on our CQRS event sourcing episode from Adam Dimitrick. He says, here's some sample code, very easy code for understanding this. I can provide an example in any programming language you like. And what this came about due to some spots that we kind of missed on that episode. And so Adam kind of went back and forth with us on Twitter and kind of talked through the bits and pieces that we missed in the discussion. I think, Beej, you were in this conversation a bit more than I was.
Yeah. Well, he in the comment, he also included a link to that Twitter conversation and to his GitHub repo with code showing the CQRS. You can find that on the website in the comments. From there, you can look at the conversation back and forth. It was really great. Adam, we want to say thanks. That's so amazing. Love it when we get people that know the stuff we're talking about even better than us and jump on and give us some great feedback on it and good comments. Correct us when we're wrong. That's awesome. I also personally really appreciate being able to see it in working code, because this is a concept that, while I understood the concept of the idea around it, I was having trouble getting a concrete way of doing it down. But send us an email with your contact information, because we've got a Complete Developer water bottle just for you. And guys, if you'd like your very own Complete Developer water bottle, leave us a review in iTunes or comment on the website or any of our social media. We post all of our episodes to Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Google+. We're also on Path, Instagram, and Tumblr. You can check us out each week on Facebook and Twitter Live, where we answer some listener questions and talk about what's going on in the tech world. Or join the conversation anytime via Slack by going to slack.completedevelopernetwork.com.
It's that time of year again. Will and I are getting ready for Nashville's premier polyglot technology conference. This year, Music City Code has combined forces with Music City Agile and Music City Data, and by their powers combined, they form Music City Tech.
Have you ever wondered what it's like to record a podcast? Well, sit in the audience as we host a panel at the conference that will later, through the magic of BJ's extensive editing, become an episode. Meet us and the Junior Developer Toolbox crew at our booth and get some cool CDP swag.
Music City Tech is a 3-day event, May 31st through June 2nd, consisting of simultaneous conferences, Music City Code, Music City Agile, and Music City Data, each focused on a particular community of technology professionals, all held at Vanderbilt University. Tickets went on sale April 1st with early bird pricing at 50%, and attendees can register at completedeveloper.musiccitytech.com.
Most of us have tried to get better about unit testing with varying degrees of success. Some folks even manage to succeed. Whether it is due to inexperience, frameworks designed without consideration of testing, or simple management resistance to regular testing, the challenges to getting it right are substantial. However, the rewards are great, which is why we've brought John Callaway and Clayton Hunt on the show.
We met John at DevSpace in Huntsville, Alabama this past year. He stopped by and chatted with us, which led to Slack and email conversations and ultimately this episode. A Microsoft MVP, John has been a professional developer since 1999. That was the year I graduated high school. He has focused primarily on web technologies and has experience with everything from PHP to C# to React.js to SignalR. Clean code and professionalism are particularly important to him, as well as mentoring and teaching others what he has learned along the way.
Clayton has been programming professionally since 2005, doing mostly web development with an emphasis on JavaScript and C#. He has a focus on software craftsmanship and is a signatory of both the Agile Manifesto and the Software Craftsmanship Manifesto. He believes that through short iterations and the careful gathering of requirements that we can deliver the highest quality and the most value in the shortest time. He enjoys learning and encouraging others to continuously improve themselves.
They are 2/3 of the trio that hosts the Six Figure Developer podcast, and they run the stpete.net meetup. John and Clayton have recently released a book, Practical Test-Driven Development Using C#7, Unleash the Power of TDD by Implementing Real-World Examples Under .NET Environment and JavaScript. That's a mouthful, so I'm just going to call it the TDD book from now on. But would you guys like to give us sort of the elevator pitch for the book, or just sort of some brief information about it?
Sure, yeah. So we decided to write a book about test-driven development to really be a guide to helping people get their feet wet and gain a better understanding of the practice altogether. Clayton and I started working together a couple of years ago at a small renewed startup where he was actually the one that came in and introduced TDD to the team. So naturally, it was pretty easy to work with him and work towards crafting an excellent book about gaining an understanding of test-driven development.
That's really cool. I also noticed when we were looking into the information about it that a mutual friend of ours wrote the foreword, John Sonmez. So that's really cool. He's been on the show a couple of times. So, but I have a first question that I like to ask all of our guests before we really get into the episode. And it's just sort of a personal thing. This podcast started out as my journey into technology, and through flashbacks and other things has told Will's journey as well. But we like to ask our guests, what got you guys into development or interested in it at first?
Sure. So in about third grade, I was in a Pegasus program, a kind of a precursor to a magnet school program where they pulled all the gifted and talented students together. And within that program, they had a computer lab of sorts set up with maybe 8 or 10 Apple IIe computers. And they started teaching us some rudimentary programming where we could print out our name across the screen, then we could print it out diagonally across the screen and over and over and over again throughout the day until it was time to shut off the computers. So that was probably my first introduction to computers and rudimentary programming, and it just kind of progressed from there.
Sounds very similar to mine. I started in fourth grade with those old Apple computers and stuff. So yeah. Clayton, how about you?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure exactly how old I was, but we had a computer in my house pretty much all the way back to my first memories. And of course, computers were invented so you could play games, right? So I had to figure out how to play games on the computers that we had. And back in the old DOS days, that often meant that you had to customize the auto-execute bat file.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
And the config sys. So while a lot of people may not consider that programming, you're putting together instructions and getting the computer to do different things based on those instructions. So that's kind of where I started. And then I found an old book in my dad's stuff from I don't even know when, and it had several applications or little programs written in GW Basic. And so I actually had a Tandy 2000 computer, and it had GW Basic on it. So I started writing those applications and running them and experimenting with them. And then it wasn't long before I found QBasic and started messing with Gorilla and Nibbles and changing the different values and seeing what effect that had. And once I got to manipulating those games and making them do different things, the things that I wanted them to do, I was hooked. So I never stopped programming after that.
I can kind of understand that. My dad got our first computer by trading a shed for it.
Yeah. Not to sound redneck or anything.
It's a story I've heard 1,000 times.
Oh man, I also did a fair bit of GW Basic back in the day, so that's a good starting point.
I mean, it's nice, simple, easy introduction, and that doesn't exist as much anymore.
Yeah, it really doesn't. It's sad how challenging it is to get into development compared to what it used to be. Because back in the day, I mean, you can still like put a batch file out there and mess with it, and you can still do little console apps. But it's almost like the user expectations have gone so far that people they fail to see how neat it actually is to build something.
Yeah, my kids have a couple programming applications on their iPads, but they wouldn't even touch them if they couldn't get an animated character in about 5 seconds. Yeah. Whereas I would spend days trying to get a character to move at all.
Yeah. So what is unit testing, and how does it differ from integration testing or automated UI testing?
So unit testing is not really what a lot of people think it is. So a lot of people would say that unit testing is testing a very, very tiny piece of your application. Like you're just going to test part of a method, right? But if you go back and you look at the original source for unit testing, Kent Beck, in his book, he says that a unit test is simply a test of the application that is not affected by the other tests. So it runs in isolation. So really, a unit test could go all the way through the entire system as long as the other tests that you're going to run won't affect it. Now, when you compare that to integration testing or automated UI testing, when somebody says an integration test, what they typically mean is that it's integrating either with, like, say, the database or another like a remote API, right? You're testing that you can actually use something else that's external to the code that you actually wrote. And then automated UI testing is what some people would call an end-to-end test. So you'll test from the perspective of the user interface all the way through the application, and just do that in an automated fashion instead of having a QA engineer do that manually.
How does that work? Because we have our QA engineers do it manually, and I think it's mainly because our lead QA doesn't know how to automate, but how exactly does that work? I'm curious.
There's a lot of different ways, and it really depends on your setup. So if you were doing an Angular application, then...
Which we do.
Right. So the Angular team has a tool that they call Protractor, and it actually lets you programmatically use the UI of Angular. And then so you can kind of program your UI tests that way. But there are also third-party utilities that will kind of treat the whole thing like a macro. So you hit a record button, and then you just have somebody click and do the manual test, and it will record the whole process. And then when you're done, you click the stop button, and then you go in and you fill out it'll capture every action that you took, and then you go back and you tell it which actions you care about. So like maybe the username you care about, and you want to use a set of usernames. So run the test 10 times with 10 different users. Those applications can cost money, though, so you don't see those too often. And setting up something like Protractor actually takes quite a bit of effort. So that's probably why you guys are doing it manually.
Yeah, but our development speed is suffering because our testers can't keep up with the developers. So the end of a 3-week sprint, that last week or half week, developers are just sitting around doing nothing. Usually we're like, the team I'm on, the developers, both of us are pretty, we're doing things like, oh, hey, we don't have this, so let's see if I can integrate this into the application while, over in dev, while nobody is like trying to build anything. But yeah, that's awesome. I want to look into both of those now.
Yeah, so, I would say definitely look at Protractor if you're interested in doing the automated UI testing.
So, moving on, what is the point of test-driven development?
So, a lot of people would say that it's about testing, but really the main focus of TDD is about design. So, when you're practicing test-driven development, there are 3 stages, 3 steps. You want to have a red cycle where you can write a test and you can see it fail. Then you can have a green phase where you make the test pass, and then you go back and refactor afterwards. And that includes your production code as well as your test code. So what that is just short iteration cycles, reinforcing the fact that you are indeed doing the things that you think you're doing, that your application is doing the things that you're doing. And it leads to a very simple, clean, elegant design, oftentimes, because you've gotten to the point where your method, where your function, where your class is doing the thing it needs to do without all the extra stuff you might have thought you would have had to do in the beginning. So if you've ever sat down and done a whiteboard session and diagrammed out a number of classes that you think you might need to solve a particular problem, and then gone to implement that, how often do you end up with the diagram that you whiteboarded in your code?
Very rarely.
Right.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever.
Well, the way that I've always put that to people is no battle plan survives first contact.
Right. So it's still a good exercise to go through that, because it gets you thinking about the edge cases and, we need to be sure that we account for X, Y, and Z, right? So as you're going through that bullet point, maybe you're going through the whiteboard exercise with coworkers, with people of different disciplines like QA and BA and project managers and whatever the case may be. They can help you with those definitions and finding out, make sure that it only accepts characters here. Make sure it only accepts numbers here. Make sure that if this is input with this value, that it throws an exception or it logs to a database or whatever. So you can put in those cases ahead of time. You can write them down on a notepad beside you. Whatever the case may be, as long as you're capturing that information and then going about the process of developing the application guided by your tests.
Yeah, I feel like the big thing that it's helped me on when I've been in a situation to do it, which is not all the time because I'm still stuck on web forms a lot of times. But the big thing it gets for me is it just avoids regressions because I've got that suite of tests that just go, hey, look, I can run these and make sure I didn't backslide. I don't build 2 weeks worth of work and find out I broke the rest of the system.
That is nice. My biggest thing with the TDD is getting used to the time that it takes, because it takes a little bit more upfront time of build the test and then build the code.
So given all this, what other benefits do you see that are offered by unit testing, like as far as like at the organizational level or beyond just the code?
It can reduce overall bugs, and it can make bug resolution faster. So the organization benefits from that, hopefully. Less downtime because somebody got something wrong. I suppose if you're doing test-driven development, then it might lead you to ask the business certain questions that you may have either not asked as early or not asked at all if you were not doing it, which might lead to better requirements in the end.
Yeah,
I think, John, do you have anything else?
Yeah, and Will, like you mentioned, it helps with regression. Helps with catching those regression bugs from being introduced. If you have a test defining that the method or function under test returns a string in this value in this manner or in this format, and you get a new requirement or somebody comes in behind you and changes the method signature or whatever the case may be, and now you have a failing test, you can easily validate that just by running the test suite. You can talk to the business owners and say, is this still a valid test case? Is this a new requirement, or is this just something that has changed or something that we've broken along the way?
Yeah, and that's something else I've noticed too that does for you. Because like when you have a regression, like the quicker you pick it up, the cheaper it is to fix. Like once you get a fossilized regression, we call that a feature. And but when they sit around a while, right? Like they get more stuff piled on them. But one thing I've noticed with unit tests and regression is that when you have one and it pops up like that, now you go, okay, I know the other parts of the system that I'm potentially damaging by touching something, because I can kind of see that in the failing unit tests. And like I've worked on a lot of older systems that don't really have any docs, and if they have unit tests, like that's sort of a backdoor documentation almost for how the pieces fit together.
Yeah, comprehensive unit test suite beats outdated documents any day.
Yeah, and of course that brings up a little personal thing that I've always said that seems like it ticks people off, but I always refer to a comment that has sat in the source code for long enough as a lie, because it usually becomes one eventually, because it doesn't, they aren't managed the same way as the rest of the code. So and the tests kind of force that on you.
Something that's interesting I've had to deal with recently as I've been going into an app that was built by a developer that's no longer with us doesn't make sense because he's alive. He just doesn't work there anymore. That no longer works there. Anyways, we've had to change some things like Boolean that now the business team wants to be able to have not applicable in there. So we're changing it to a string and have to change it all the way down through the database and all that fun stuff. But something I have noticed is that one thing I like about VisualStudio.net is that it won't let me build until I go and fix the unit tests, because, it won't let me try to, even though I'm not running the test, it'll still won't let me build until I go in and fix that.
Yeah, that really keeps people from shipping stuff that's busted. I mean, that's huge.
I like that. That's what I was getting at. Was it's a really nice thing to have, because you can, like you said, you can make sure that the changes you're making aren't going to break other things.
Clayton, you've got experience with a tri-state checkbox, right?
Yeah, I wrote a blog post on how to do one in Knockout.
Oh, dude, I'm using Knockout, and I just did I did not a tri-state one, but I just did a checkbox component like 2 weeks ago because I wanted it to color code based on whether this is an addition or it's setting it back to normal or if it's a removal, so that they could easily tell. And I did a whole component and everything. It was over the top. It was so much fun.
Well, when they want to make it tri-state, I've got a blog post for you.
All right, I'll find that for sure because they'll ask. It's coming.
I think somewhere in the blog post it says, "Don't do this."
That's. I'll just.
It definitely says
I'll
that in the
just
comments.
skim that part and do it anyway. that's called desperation. Like that's how the control and the C get hit on Stack Overflow. So.
Uh-huh. So, hey, speaking of that, what are some of the things that people get wrong about unit testing and test-driven development?
I think one of the biggest ones, and you won't realize you've been doing it wrong until it bites you, is tying your tests too closely to your implementation. So I believe that your tests, I kind of fall in line with the whole BDD concept. So your tests should represent the business rules. They should not necessarily represent how you've decided to implement those business rules. That way, when you decide to go and change stuff later on, like the implementation, you want to refactor or move this thing over into a class in some other module or put this in a different DLL. You won't break your test because the overarching code is still doing the exact same thing that it was doing. It's just you've decided to restructure how it's doing it. If you've tied your test too closely to the implementation, those kinds of changes will cause you to break hundreds of tests, and then you have to go and fix hundreds of tests.
We actually we had a question here about Bob Martin stated that the structure of your unit test should not necessarily reflect the structure of your project. So since we've already hit this point, I figure we'll go ahead and just go with the rest of that question. If that's true, then how would you structure your tests? Like how would you do you said you did the BDD or behavior driven development thing? Can we unpack that a little bit more?
Sure. So let's say that it's a dream world and you've gotten the requirements that you actually would like to get. So for me, that is a user story. So as whatever the role is, I want some kind of feature so that, and whatever my reason for wanting that is, followed by some acceptance criteria. This is how the QA and the business will know that I have programmed it successfully. And I prefer to have those in what's called Gherkin format.
I'm familiar with that.
Right. So given some pre-context, when I take some kind of action, then I can expect some result. If I get my requirements in that structure and it's devoid of UI, it's not given, I'm on the home page. When I click the info button, then I see info. As long as it's not like that, if it's devoid of UI and it actually contains the business rules, then I can almost take that Gherkin acceptance criteria and turn it directly into unit tests. And then I'm covering the use case. I'm not covering the code that's actually accomplishing the use case. And that to me is how the test should be written. The business person, they may not understand the code, but they should be able to go and look at the names of the tests and understand that those tests are fulfilling the business need.
So do you name your methods in such a way that they can be parsed by a tool when the process runs, so that you kick the results out and a business owner type person can see it?
If I was given the right format for the requirements, then I would strive to. Typically, I'm not given those kinds of requirements. And so my test names fit my understanding of what the business is asking for. In which case, if you were to output the names, it may not quite deliver what the business would need for that. But I would love to get to that point. I've just got to train up a BA and a PM at some point.
Yeah, and Steve Smith has an excellent blog post on this subject as well about structuring unit tests, entitled Unit Test Naming Convention. And I stumbled upon this a couple of months ago as we were writing the book. I was experimenting with naming conventions and how to structure some of the code and how to more closely match what Clayton's describing here, is that we're testing behavior, not necessarily testing methods and functions. So I came up with a structure that I've liked. Clayton has a structure that he's comfortable with, that I enjoy a great deal. And kind of through this process, just kind of happenstance, on Twitter, I saw that Steve Smith kind of retweeted this older blog post. I think it's from 2011 or something like that. So, it still holds true today. So, any kind of thought you give to this and plan accordingly will just help you in the long run.
Oh, I was looking at his. His looks like it's, the class name is kind of like the should chunk of the BDD, and then the actual methods are the actual assertion, or the name, not the assertion, but like the rest of that sentence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he's aligning his structure so that when his test suite runs, it reads like the like a user story, or like an acceptance criteria might read.
I had some issue when I very first started my first job, which was at the state. They had me as a junior developer going in and writing unit tests. It's a great introduction to the code base. What threw me off was the different developers in there had different naming conventions for their tests. And so at first it was so confusing, because some of them looked like they were saying the same thing. I'm like, why do you have two tests that do the same thing? Until I got really in there and found out what it was doing. But, that naming conventions can be very important, and sticking with it across developers.
Yeah, within a team, it's usually best to pick something, and it may be, it might be what you feel is suboptimal, but if the whole team can agree upon it, then that's really what you should go for. That way, anyone on the team can open up any of the tests and understand what's going on.
Yeah, that would have been very convenient for me starting out. Of course, I went back and renamed quite a few of them just to do that. I put them all in the same format because I'm a little OCD like that.
I do that with capital D's. Whenever I see ID, I change all the D's to lower.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, man.
I used to come in behind him and change them back.
What you do is you change every other one, and then you skip two just one time. Like, if you really want to sink that in.
So moving on with the questions, getting back into them, how do you use unit testing, test-driven design in an automated build process?
So I've recently started on a new greenfield project where it's myself and one other developer, and we've got 6 or 8 different projects of varying complexity going right now. One React website, a couple of .NET Core 2.0 web API backends, and a couple of other processes. And I've also kind of been delegated the role of DevOps and setting up our CI/CD pipeline. So right now we're using TFS on-prem, using Git repository within TFS, set up the CI pipeline so that we're essentially gating all our merges. So when we do a pull request, the build must succeed, and part of the CI build is running of the unit test suite, whether it's in React and Jest or whether it's in .NET. I think we're using XUnit for most of the projects. So if any of those tests fail, then the build fails, and the PR, the pull request, cannot be completed and merged. And I've also set up on the React website that if we fall below a certain threshold of coverage and things like that, then it also fails the build.
So that's you're doing that with TFS and Git, because that's what we're using at work, and we've been talking about wanting to do this. So this is one of the questions that was really important to me. So that's awesome, because you're talking about the stuff that we're doing.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than bringing down a fresh clone of a repository, run the unit test, and everything breaks.
Well, I'll tell you a pattern I've seen that an automated build process would actually catch is people abusing unit test frameworks for stuff that's not a test. In other words, for resetting a chunk of data to a certain state, and they'll set up tests to do that, and then they just right click them and run them when they're actually manually testing stuff. So it seems like the automated testing, if you've got it tied in and you've got good code coverage metrics, that gets rid of a lot of really weird, janky shenanigans that trip people up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you want to just make sure that you're setting the code metrics with good faith. You don't want to say we must hit 80% code coverage, no ifs, ands, or buts. Because I've worked on projects in the past where they were not written with testing in mind. They were not testable in their current state. And it was mandated that we had to get coverage. I told my boss, I can write tests to cover this. They will be wholly meaningless. And he said, well, we got to follow the policies and procedures that have been dictated. So go ahead and do what you have to do.
Mm-hmm. And I've run into that before as well, especially like in the web forms world, because I still deal with a lot of older code bases. I mean, heck, sometimes I program in Delphi, no kidding. And being able to test in that can be very interesting, especially with old web forms. That seems like it's even worse than Delphi is in terms of just stuff being really tightly coupled in the framework, and you can't really get in there and test things like you would really want to. So how do you manage complexity on your unit tests? I mean, we talked about naming, but there's lots of other stuff too, like name spacing, your code reuse, all that kind of stuff. How do you structure your overall testing projects?
So from a overall structure, and I do this with even with my code that's not test code. Uncle Bob, Robert Martin, suggests only having methods that are 5 lines or less in size. And I kind of took that to heart and applied it to everything. So when I'm writing my code, if a method exceeds the 5 lines, then I'll break it out into more than one method. If a class exceeds 5 methods, then I'll break it out into more than one class. If a folder exceeds 5 classes, then I will strongly think about breaking it out into multiple folders. If a project exceeds more than 5 folders, then I will strongly think about breaking that out into multiple projects. And I do the exact same thing with the tests, except for it's slightly different. So I worry less about the line length of a test because it's usually pretty small. I mean, we're talking like 3 or 4 lines max anyway, because I have the arrangement where I set up the pre-context of the test, and then I have the action where I usually just 1 line. I don't ever have more than 1 line for my action, and then the assertions are 1 to 2 lines. So my tests are pretty small to start with, but within a test class, I won't have more than 5 overall things that I'm testing, or 5 units, or 5 overall logical assertions, and that tends to reduce the overall size of any one thing within my test projects. And then I am constantly, both John and I are constantly looking for any kind of pain that we're experiencing within any of our programming. So the second that we can find that pain, and we are actively looking for it, then we try to come up with a plan to reduce that pain, either by refactoring something or creating a helper utility. I have a dependency injection utility that I wrote. It's about 50 lines long, and I use that specifically for testing. That way, if I have classes with dependencies, I don't necessarily have to configure those dependencies at the beginning of each test class. I can just inject them from an already pre-configured point within the test project. And we have several things kind of like that.
That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, some of the stuff that because I just recently introduced Auto Mapper, whereas before we were manually coding converting from the view model to the data model. That was a pain. Saved a lot of time with it, but with my unit tests, I have to initiate the mapper and a couple of other things, but that just the whole idea of injecting that into the unit test, I don't want to say mind blown, but that's an idea I had not thought of doing. So that's cool.
Yeah, and you were talking about the way you structure it, but one thing that I've found that's been really painful is when you get one of those large untested code bases and you start trying to shimmy tests in there. Like, I'm coming up on that very soon on the project that I'm on. Like, I have to have dependency injection actually up and working, I think, probably before I can do much with it. But how would you like structuring those tests in an ongoing, like basically eating the code base with tests. That's something I don't completely understand how to cleanly structure. And I was wondering if you had any tips on that.
That's where it gets a bit sticky.
I was afraid of that.
We have a whole chapter in the book devoted to writing tests around the worst code that I could possibly think of to write. I mean, I've got go-tos in the C#.
Yep.
Which they should never have even put in the language.
I didn't even know that was in the language.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm new,
it.
but
It's not in the language. Forget I ever said anything.
Or or when you get volatile, or you start reacting or interacting with like unmanaged code heavily.
Yeah, I really would have loved to use the unsafe keyword, but I just couldn't think of a way to use it in the sample application that I was demonstrating with.
Or pointers.
However,
like you could have manipulated images.
I mean, I already wrote my own to lower abstraction that was split across 3 different labeled lines and used go-tos to jump to the different pieces. So,
wow!
I don't even I don't have any words for that.
Yeah, but then I wrote tests for it, right, as part of the book. And this is a console application, and it was never written with the intent for it to be anything other than everything in the void main of the program CS file application. So the first thing that you have to do is write a characterization test. Some people call it a gold standard test. And what it does is it takes a section of the application. In this case, it was the whole application because it's a small application. But with yours, you'd probably take a section, like one class, and you don't touch any of the code. You just run the class with all its dependencies, console, write line, and everything. Now, you can't run that right off the bat all the time because maybe you're depending on some third-party utility and you can't actually run that utility, or you're depending on ADO.NET code that you can't actually run. You are forced to write some code without tests so that you can refactor just enough of it to get tests around it. That whole process is not fun. But after you get to the point where you've got one gold standard characterization test around the code that you're looking to isolate, everything else starts to fall into place pretty quick. But it is a bit of a trek through the mud to get to the point where you're testing that.
Yeah, that sounds like what basically what I've experienced in the past. I thought, maybe this is so hard because I'm just terrible at it. That's what I was really hoping for there. But I mean, there's not a. I mean, I agree with you. There's not a real good way to get in there. You just have to sort of. It's like winning a slugging match. You just kind of get hit.
Yeah. Unfortunately, writing tests for code that was never meant to be tested is hard.
Yeah, because inevitably the code that was written without testability in mind also breaks every one of the solid principles. It's tightly coupled. You're not going to get any clean way into that application or that method or that class. So what I've found is you're usually going to be approaching a legacy application like this to either add functionality or change functionality. So you can look at, well, I know that I need to write this new method, or I need to add this functionality to this part of the application, I think. So that maybe you can start with testing of that method or test driving that method or that functionality, and then go from there. And then you can see that, yeah, I can modify this class enough to inject the dependencies that I need. And then I can look at, oh yeah, this makes sense. Now I can start to unravel a little bit more of this class. Maybe with unraveling that, I can unravel a couple of other side classes and kind of pull it out from there.
Yeah. So speaking of code that wasn't designed to be tested, should you and how would you unit test things like a database?
Or the interaction with one?
Yeah.
Specifically for testing the database, should you want to venture into it, there is a SQL unit project. So you can actually write SQL-based unit tests. Would I? Not really.
Yeah, the app we work on at work, a lot of logic is in the database. We've got some really heavy stored procs, and that's because we've had multiple teams. Like we've got a Delphi team and a .NET team, and that's a safe way to do code sharing in some cases, as bad as that is. Plus we've got large data sets. Like we've got some clients that have got, 250 million rows in some of their tables. And so that actually would be pretty useful to me, would be database testing. So I'll definitely have to check that one out.
Yeah, in a system where you are heavily dependent on stored procs, I might suggest doing the database testing. Either SQL unit, which I'll admit I have not set up. I've looked into it briefly several years ago, or just write a simple C# application with a testing layer to. I would suggest setting up either a database project that you could clone a local version of the database with, or getting a copy of the database specifically for testing. This way, you're not messing with production data or even data that some QA analyst is depending on in some test environment. And then that way, your test can essentially wipe out all the data, set up whatever context you want to test around, run the stored proc, validate the results, and move on to the next testing scenario.
Yeah, I have a few dev databases that are full of unit test information from where I was just like, I need to make sure the mappings are right, or make sure the DBA didn't fall asleep at the wheel and forget to give grants somewhere, because that happens a lot.
Yeah, the other thing I've done is actually have C# code for working out the unit testing of stored procedures. You start a transaction and you do your call and you get your data back, and then you roll the transaction back.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's definitely an option.
Yeah, that has actually worked surprisingly well. It's tedious, but I mean, once it's there, if you don't change the proc, it's there.
Yeah. So we've talked about some bad practices and some things to avoid when creating unit tests and when driving your development with testing. What are some good practices you can use to make sure your tests are maintainable over the long run?
I would say don't forget to refactor your tests. Your test suite is just as important, if not more important, than your production code. Because if you lost your production code, if you have a comprehensive suite of unit tests, you should feel fairly confident that you could reproduce something or get something in a workable fashion. So keeping those in check and making sure that they're well kept is a good first step.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because it's almost like it's a checksum for your code in some ways. I've had a situation where somebody checked a test in for code that they didn't check in, and they went on vacation, and I was able to just rebuild their code or what it should have done based on the tests and go on with life. That's happened once or twice to me. So
another good point is to remember that you are testing small units or small pieces that should not have interconnected dependencies. So that you should feel comfortable to substitute a mock or a spy or some kind of fake implementation. But the caveat there is be careful not to test your mock or fake or spy. So I've seen some people kind of go overboard and they end up testing their fakes and
I've seen that, or testing the like in .NET at least. I've seen people test the framework.
Mm-hmm. I've seen that too.
I draw the line at the end of my code. Yeah. Wherever my code ends, that's where I stop testing.
I mean, just testing that, like if I set a property and then I get the value back out of it, and it's not on an object I own. I've seen that kind of stuff floating.
Yeah, that's a good point too. We want to make sure that we abstract away all third-party code, and that includes the .NET framework. So if you see things just as simple as datetime.now, it's pretty good practice to go ahead and abstract that away into something like a time manager that you can inject and then substitute your own values if you need to test for specific dates and times.
Right. And actually, one of the things that I didn't realize early on in my career, it was sorting dates. Like if you have them represented as a string, that's not sorting the same way as the date in date time format. I actually turned a sale back on, because of a date restriction like that. And there was no way, had I been writing tests, of course, this was like in-unit wasn't even out then. Like this would have been 2003. If I'd had an object that returned a fake value for datetime.now, I could have actually seen how this thing would have reacted, 2 days later when it went live.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And I've had to deal with some interesting stuff that people who didn't really understand unit testing, but were trying to, had to do there. Speaking of people not understanding unit tests, how do you sell unit testing to a team that may be skeptical of its benefits?
It can be difficult. Probably the best way to win somebody over to your perspective is to not try to win them over to your perspective. So a lot of times when I've gone into teams where they weren't doing testing, whether they were interested in it or not, I will simply start doing the testing myself, and I will look for excuses to pair program with the other individuals on the team so that they can see how I'm programming. And hopefully I can sit with them and maybe make some suggestions for how they are programming. And eventually they'll see me writing the tests, and they'll see the benefits, because I'll make a mistake or they'll make a mistake, and then the test will break. And then we'll go, oh, well, good thing we caught that now. And we can move on in 10 seconds instead of spending half an hour debugging something. Mm-hmm. After they start to see that benefit, then they'll usually ask for more information about testing. And after they get past the point where their head hurts a little bit, and they start doing testing on their own, they'll find a lot of instances where the test actually saves them from spending a lot of time trying to fix something that they didn't really need to spend a whole lot of time fixing, because it was a simple thing that they just overlooked. And that's kind of the winning point, is when they see that they just saved themselves a couple hours of work because they had a test tell them that they had just broke something.
Oh, I like that approach. That's what I did to get logging into our apps where I'm working now, because when I started, nobody was doing it. And I was like, well, I'm just going to put it into my stuff. And as my lead developer and then upper management started seeing how much faster I could fix bugs and solve problems, they're like, why is it so much faster when you do it? I was like, well, it's because I just look at the log and I can tell exactly what's wrong. And so like it's the same thing with unit testing. And I love that approach, which is not the convince them to do it, but it is lead by example and show them, hey, here's the benefit because you can see me getting it.
Yeah, it's that what is it? Be so good they can't ignore you kind of concept.
Yep, be the 800-pound gorilla. Yeah.
Yeah, Clayton actually introduced test-driven development to our team a number of years ago. I had started with this renewed startup under the guise that they were doing TDD. During the interview process, I said, I don't have any experience with this, but I'm happy to learn. When I came on board, it was only then that I found out they weren't actually doing it yet, but they wanted to. Clayton came on board a couple of months after that, and he actually had some experience and started kind of refactoring the code into a little bit more testable state, and then slowly started introducing tests, and then slowly started yelling at people when we broke his tests. And then just as a team, it was decided that was the path we were going. We started doing lunch and learns 3 and 4 days a week. We would watch videos during lunch. We would practice together. We kind of banged our heads on the table together. This was a team of about, 6 or 8 or 10 developers. And I would say as a team, it took us about 3 months for the entire team to get up to speed and be as productive as we were before, and not as aggravated and wanting to kill one another. And I've quoted that 3-month figure a couple of times to different people, and people are either shocked one way or the other that either that's too long or that's not long enough. And it's not long enough for the people that have struggled and not followed through and given up to go and continue on the way they're comfortable developing. And but for a team that size, I think that was about right. But what I've discovered since then is that I'm much, much faster as a developer as a result of learning TDD. I think, Beej, you mentioned earlier that it's a commitment, and it does slow you down in the beginning until you're comfortable, until you have the mindset of a test-driven developer. Then you can start thinking about the paths through a system, how I might need to structure the code, what the dependencies are, and how I can avoid those dependencies. I've also worked other places where I've been the one to introduce TDD. One such place was a consultancy that they had tried to introduce TDD, or at least they tried to introduce unit testing, but they did so in a way that they added it as a line item to their clients. And that was usually the first thing that went. The clients were not going to pay for more code, so of course they ended up paying for
more bugs,
3 or 4 times the amount of development time because of more bugs, because of more manual testing.
I can see that.
So, given the whole thing about a team, how would how do you sell it to management? Is there anything that you do, especially when you're trying to get management on your side for pushing TDD?
It's a personal practice. It's a development practice. You just declare that this is how I write code. Clayton has been one to say that. Well, Clayton, I'll let you speak for yourself.
Well, so Uncle Bob has said in some of his videos and lectures and stuff that it's a point of professionalism. They hired you because you supposedly know how to do your job. So who are they to tell you how to do your job? I've never asked for permission. I've never even bothered to tell my managers that I was doing TDD. I just do TDD. And if they ever ask and they tell me to stop, I'll just tell them no. This is how I write code. And usually by the time that they find out I'm doing TDD, I've already proven that I'm faster and that my code just does not have bugs. Which, just for clarity, TDD does not guarantee, but I have a significantly lower bug rate. And I contributed 100% to TDD.
The best water cooler discussion I was ever involved in, I was pretty new to a contract with American Express Serve in the St. Petersburg, Florida area, where the management team was brought in from old Netflix VPs and senior devs and architects. And one of our development directors and my manager were speaking near the water cooler, and I just happened to kind of come in and eavesdrop and join in on the conversation a bit. And the development director said, TDD 1, that's just how we do code. That's how we develop software.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Now, guys, unit testing is a valuable skill to have no matter where your code runs or what it does. It reduces the error rate of your software and can help force a better structure into your code. In addition, this practice can make it easier to make large changes to your software with less risks, as well as making it easier for new developers to understand the structure of your software. We want to thank John and Clayton for joining us and answering our questions and having a great conversation. That was really awesome. I got more than I expected out of it. Check out their book. We'll have a link to where you can find it in the show notes. John, Clayton, where can our listeners find you to learn more?
Well, you can find us at our blog and podcast site at sixfiguredev.com. Of course, we've got a Twitter handle at sixfiguredev. And then my personal Twitter handle is Matsu Bonsai.
And my personal Twitter handle is at ClaytonHunt_104.
Thanks, guys, again for coming on. Like I said, I've learned a lot from this, and I think Will has too. We got a lot out of it. That pretty much wraps us up. Before we close everything out, Will, what do you have for us this week for Tricks of the Trade?
Well, it's something that I brought up probably like our 3rd or 4th episode. So it's time to bring it up again, I guess. And that's one of the words that we like to use in software development. We like to talk about bugs. And I think a lot of times we really do ourselves a disservice by calling them bugs rather than defects. Because if like the term defect is semantically loaded where you actually understand what's going on. Whereas a bug, it's like, an ant crawled in here. Whereas a defect is like, hey, this airbag just blew up in somebody's face while they were going down the interstate. And our use of the word bug trivializes the kind of problems that we can create by ignoring big problems in our software. And I just want to throw out the idea that maybe we should all start using the term defect just because of this minimization. In other words, this goes along with the unit testing. It's like we want to prevent it, and we want to prevent it because it's a real problem, not a random insect flying into a system. And that's about all I got.
Titanfall.
If you have a question or comment, please email us at neckbeards@CompleteDeveloperPodcast.com. Our theme music is an excerpt from Stand By for Titanfall by Pure Bells, available on SoundCloud and licensed through Creative Commons.
The intro music for IoTs is Hillbilly Hip Hop by Jason Belcher. For references, show notes, and to sign up for weekly emails with extra tips and insights, be sure to check out the website at CompleteDeveloperPodcast.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at CompleteDevPod and like our page on Facebook to keep up with news about the show. Catch us each week as we broadcast live, talking about what's going on in the tech world and answering listener questions.
Learn more about all of our shows and groups by going to CompleteDeveloperNetwork.com, where you'll find links to Junior Developer Toolbox, Developer Launchpad, and our other communities. Thanks for listening. See you next time.